Estoy muy contento de estar aquí esta tarde. Me disculpo por mi monolinguismo. I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to the conference committee for inviting me to speak today. I'm very pleased and honored to be back at UAB, and particularly honored to be part of the tribute to Professor João Pagages, who is without a doubt one of the most important scholars in the field of teaching social science and history over the past half-century. The impact of Professor Pagages' work as a researcher and educator stretches far beyond UAB. Professor Pagages is one of the world's leading scholars on teaching history and social sciences. His scholarship has had a profound effect on theory, research, and practice of teaching history and social sciences worldwide. The creative and collaborative scholarship of Professor Pagages, along with Professors Antonio Santisteban and Montserrat Oyer, and members of GREDIX, have made UAB one of the single most important sources of research knowledge and new researchers in the world. The impact of Professor Pagages' work can be found in the research literature, as well as in classrooms and curriculum documents across the world, and more importantly, his influence is embodied in the many UAB graduates who are now teachers, scholars, and leaders in the field of teaching social sciences and history. Professor Pagages has led the creation of a truly world-class teaching and research program here at UAB, which I've benefited from through my work with and connection to people such as Edasant, Renato Gazmuri, Breo Tozar, Gustavo Gonzalez, Maria Espinet, as well as Liliano Bravo and Lucia Valencia. Since my initial visit to Barcelona in 2012, I've had the opportunity to know Professor Pagages on a more personal level. And in addition to his scholarship, I admire his enthusiasm for life, his love of family, his support for Espanol football, and his taste for cava. Thank you, João, for all the many contributions to the field and the lives and work of your students and colleagues. Just a short note in my presentation today, I'll be using the North American term social studies or social studies education rather than Didàctica de las Ciències Sociales. I'm going to, in my talk today, I'm going to try to speak to each of the three questions that frame the conference. And I'll start with what kind of teachers. I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between teachers and curriculum, then the ideology of neutrality, and then didactics as method. So I'll start with the relationship between teachers and curriculum. Embedded within the language of schooling and the image and metaphors it fosters, embedded within the language of schooling and the images and metaphors it fosters are certain assumptions about ends and means. For example, how children learn, appropriate student-teacher relations, what knowledge is of most worth, and what are the purposes of schools. For example, some common metaphors used to describe the work of teachers include gardener, facilitator, guide, pilot, navigator, map maker, gatekeeper, change agent, activist. Each of these metaphors communicates certain assumptions about teaching and learning and the relationship between teachers and curriculum. What are our images? What are your images of teachers and curriculum? How do these images shape our approaches to creating curriculum and practicing teaching? The distinction between curriculum and teaching is founded on the belief that decisions about aims and objectives of teaching must be undertaken prior to decisions about how to teach. This is the distinction between ends and means. For researchers, this distinction is a way to place boundaries around their inquiry into complex worlds of teaching and schooling. In schools, this distinction fits into a bureaucratic structure that seeks to categorize areas of concern with an emphasis on efficiency and decision-making. The means-end distinction has produced abstract categories of research and discourse that bear little resemblance to the lived experience of teachers in the classroom, where means and ends are thoroughly intertwined. Language use, educational practices, and social relationships contend with each other in the formation of teachers' professional identities and in the institutional culture of schools. For example, when curriculum and teaching are conceived as independent entities, curriculum activities become the work of one group and curriculum implementation becomes the work of another. This division of labor, in turn, affects the social relations between these groups, as one group defines the goals and conceptualizes the work, and the other is responsible for the accomplishment of the goals. The apparent indifference of educational research and bureaucratic decision-making to the reality of classroom teaching creates unequal participation and unequal power relations. The strict distinction between ends and means in curriculum work is problematic in a number of ways. First, the ends-means distinction does not accurately reflect how the enacted curriculum is created. Secondly, it justifies the separation of the conception and execution of teachers' work, which reduces teachers' control over their own work. Thirdly, it marginalizes teachers in formal curriculum decision-making. The ends-means split between curriculum and teaching narrows the professional role of teachers to the point to where they have little or no function in the formal curriculum creation. Many teachers have internalized this ends-means distinction between curriculum and their work, and as a result, they view their professional role as instructional decision makers, not as curriculum creators. But it's clear from studies of teacher decision-making that teachers do much more than select methods to implement formally adopted curriculum goals. If we conceive of social studies teaching and learning as activities that require us to pose and analyze problems in the process of understanding and transforming our world, the limitations of the ends-means approach to curriculum is clear. Social studies teaching should not be reduced to an exercise in implementing a set of activities predefined by policymakers or by a test. Rather, teachers should be actively engaged in considering the perennial curriculum question, what knowledge is of most worth? Social studies learning should not be about passively absorbing someone else's conception of the world, but rather it should be an exercise in creating personally meaningful understandings of the way the world is and how one might act to transform the world. Thinking of curriculum not as disciplinary subject matter, but as something experienced in situations is an alternative to the traditional ends-means approach to curriculum. This is a conception of curriculum as an experience in which teachers and students are at the center of the curriculum. American philosopher John Dewey, who, by the way, I noticed on the Twitter account for UAB Education, there's a quote from John Dewey that says, education is not preparation for life, it is life. And in that quote embodies the idea of curriculum as experience. Dewey argued that teachers must be students of both subject matter and pedagogy if they're going to foster student growth. The teaching profession requires teachers who have learned to apply critical thought to their work. To do this, they must have full knowledge of their subject matter, as well as observe and reflect on their practice. Dewey's notion of the classroom laboratory placed the teacher squarely in the center of efforts to understand educational practice and develop educational theory. Problems of teaching and curriculum are resolved not by the discovery of new knowledge, but by formulating and acting on practical judgment. This aim presents problems in that sometimes teachers may not be conscious of the reasons for their actions or may simply be implementing the curriculum conceived by others. This means that reflective practice must focus on both the explicit and tacit cultural environment of teaching. That is, the language, the manners, the standards, the values that unconsciously influence the classroom and school environment, and the ways in which teachers respond to it. Social studies teaching and learning should be about uncovering the taken-for-granted elements of our everyday experience and making them a target for investigation. In this mode, teaching and curriculum become problematic situations. Critical examination of the intersection of language and social relations, as well as practice, can provide insights into our work as teachers uncover constraints that affect our approaches to and our goals for social studies education. The teacher and the curriculum are inextricably linked. Our efforts to improve and transform social studies hinge on developing practices among teachers and their collaborators that emerge from critical analyses of the context of teaching and schooling, as well as self-reflection. On this slide, I think I'll translate the caption for you if you haven't already done it. I like my history teacher. He's kind of old, and I think he's lived through much of the history he's teaching. Now I'd like to talk about the ideology of neutrality. In yesterday's seminar, I spoke to this a little bit, and I'd like to expand on it. We had a nice discussion about it, too. The caption here is, we're looking for impartial people who think the way we do. The ideology of neutrality and deciding what ought to be the case. While nearly all social studies educators agree that the purpose of social studies is to prepare young people so that they possess the knowledge, values, and skills needed for active participation in society, the devil is in the details. Dewey's book, Democracy in Education, written in 1916, opens with a discussion of the way in which all societies use education as a means of social control, by which adults consciously shape the dispositions of children. He argues that education has no definite meaning until we decide what kind of a society we have in mind. In other words, there is no objective answer to the question of what the purposes of education should be, because those purposes are not things that can be discovered. As philosopher Paul Taylor argues in his book, Normative Discourse, in 1961, we must decide what ought to be the case. We cannot discover what ought to be the case by investigating what is the case. I'll read that one more time. We must decide what ought to be the case. We cannot discover what ought to be the case by investigating what is the case. This is important for educational researchers to remember in particular, because oftentimes we're trying to investigate what the case is with the eye towards coming up with transformative practices or reforming practices in education. But that question is a values-based question that we cannot discover via experiments or any kind of investigation of what actually exists. We must decide what ought to be the purpose of social studies. That means asking, what kind of society do we want to live in? Or in what sense of democracy do we want this to be a democratic society? In the last couple of days, as I've walked from the train station up to the education building here on campus, there's lots of graffiti about democracy. There's some graffiti on the sidewalk that says dictatorship or democracy. And this afternoon I paused as I was walking up the hill and I thought, well, I understand authoritarianism and dictatorship. That seems fairly clear. But in what sense of democracy is the person who wrote that on the sidewalk, what kind of democracy were they thinking of? Were they thinking of the democracy where when you go to vote, the government, a higher authority comes and takes the ballot boxes away? Are you thinking about a democracy like the one in Poland, where the Supreme Court has been dissolved by the government? Is that the kind of democracy that you're thinking about? Are you thinking about a direct democracy where the people really rule? So we have to be clear about what kind of society we want to live in and what kind of democracy we want to live in, if that is our choice. In order to construct meaning for social studies education, we must engage these questions not as merely abstract and rhetorical, but in relation to our lived experiences and our professional practices as educators. Taking this approach to teaching represents an important challenge to social studies teachers, specifically how to overcome the ideology of neutrality. Now, the educators that I work with in both teacher education programs and teachers in schools, particularly secondary teachers, often reject openly political or ideological agendas for teaching in schools as inappropriate and unprofessional. The university professors tell the new teachers, stick to the facts, guard against bias, maintain neutrality. They do this at my own institution, and sometimes that creates conflict. These are goals expressed by some teachers when they're asked to identify the keys to successful teaching. Many of these same teachers and teacher educators conceive of their roles as designing and teaching courses that ensure that students are prepared to function non-disruptively in society as it exists. This is thought to be a desirable goal, in part because it strengthens the status quo. But it's also seen as being unbiased or a neutral position. I understand this position. When you're a teacher, you want what's best for your students. And if you look at the way the world functions, you want to give them the knowledge and the skills that will allow them to succeed based on the way the world is. To me, that stance, though, is a compromise between our visions of what the world could be or should be and the way the world is. And if we think of social studies education as analyzing and taking action to solve social problems, it seems to be in contradiction with the goals of social studies, at least as I understand it. Many of these same teachers view the work in schools as apolitical, a matter of effectively covering the curriculum, imparting academic skills, and preparing students for tests. Often these teachers have attended teacher education programs designed to ensure that they were prepared to adapt to the status quo in schools. It is a paradox that some teacher education programs teach the importance of maintaining neutrality while advocating social justice education. It makes me wonder what social justice means. The ideology of neutrality that dominates current thought and practices in schools and in teacher education is sustained by theories of knowledge and conceptions of democracy that constrain rather than widen civic participation in society. And it functions to obscure the political and ideological consequences of so-called neutral schooling, neutral teaching, and neutral curriculum. Because, of course, the curriculum that comes down from governments is not neutral. The practices that we engage in our classrooms are not neutral. These consequences include conceptions of the learner as passive, democratic citizenship as a spectator project, and ultimately the maintenance of status quo inequalities in society. So the question in teaching is not whether to allow political discourse in schools or whether to advocate or not, but the question is the nature and the extent of political discourse and advocacy. It's widely believed that neutrality, objectivity, and unbiasedness are largely the same thing, and always good when it comes to schools and teaching. But consider the following. Neutrality is a political category. That is, not supporting any factions in a dispute. Holding a neutral stance in a conflict is no more likely to ensure rightness or objectivity than any other, and it may be a sign of ignorance of the issues. It seems better not to require schools include only neutral teachers at the cost of including ignoramuses or cowards and getting superficial teaching and curriculum. Absence of bias is not absence of convictions in an area. Thus, neutrality is not objectivity. To be objective is to be unbiased, unprejudiced. People are often misled to think that anyone who comes to a discussion with strong views about an issue cannot be unprejudiced. This question, however, the key question, however, is whether and how the views are justified. I don't think it's unbiased to be anti-racist. It's not unbiased to be anti-fascist. It's not unbiased to be anti-misogynist. A knowledge claim gains objectivity as a result of exposure to the fullest range of criticism. Thoughts and beliefs that depend upon authority, that is, tradition, direct instruction, or imitation, are not based on examination of evidence, and they are the equivalent of prejudices. Thus, achieving objectivity in teaching and curriculum requires that we take seriously alternative perspectives and criticisms of any particular knowledge claim. How is it possible to have or strive for objectivity in schools where political discourse is circumscribed and neutrality is demanded? And I would argue that it's impossible to teach objectively in schools where neutrality is demanded and where we don't have a full range of political discourse available, which raises the issue of academic freedom and free speech. Achieving pedagogical objectivity is no easy task. The objective teacher considers the most persuasive arguments for different points of view on any given issue and demonstrates even-handedness, focuses on positions that are supported by evidence, etc. This kind of approach to teaching is not easy. It requires significant quantities of time, discipline, and imagination. And in this light, it's not surprising that objectivity is sometimes regarded as an impossibility, particularly with contemporary social issues in which the subject matter is often controversial and seemingly more open to multiple perspectives than the natural sciences. However, to borrow a phrase from Karl Popper, objectivity in teaching can be considered a regulative principle. That is something that we should strive for. Now I would like to talk a little bit about what methods teachers should use. This graphic behind me here, there's some dance steps. We did this dance the other day in the research seminar, the dance of the dialectic, and you can read more about it in Bertel Ullmann's book by that name, Dance of the Dialectic. And this section really, I'm very much indebted to Professor Ullmann's scholarship. Reality is more than appearances, and focusing exclusively on appearances, on the evidence that strikes us immediately and directly, can be misleading. Basing an understanding of ourselves and our world on what we see, hear, or touch in our immediate surroundings can lead us to conclusions that are distorted or false. Like if you just watch Fox News 24 hours a day. As Bertel Ullman argues, understanding anything in our everyday experience requires us to know something about how it arose, how it developed, how it fits into a larger context or system of which it is a part. But just recognizing this is not enough. After all, few would deny that everything in the world is changing and interacting at some pace or in one way or another. That history and systemic connections belong in the real world. The difficulty has always been, how do we think adequately about those things, how not to distort them, and how to give them the attention and weight that they deserve. Dialectics, Ullman explains, is an attempt to resolve this difficulty by expanding the notion of a thing, and here I'm talking about anything, just like it could be in the physical world or it could be in our consciousness, in our language, concepts, objects, events, narratives. How can we expand the notion of any of those particulars to include both the process by which it has become the thing, how did that object become the object, and the broader interactive context in which it's found? This is where my printed out talk got messed up in the printer. Dialectics restructures thinking about reality by replacing the common sense notion of thing with something that has a history and has external connections to other things, with the notion of process and a relation. Chris Scabera, who is a colleague of Ullman's at New York University, describes dialectics as the art of context keeping. How do we keep the context? And I want to point out that Ullman is surely one of the most important Marxist scholars of the last 50 years, 75 years. Chris Scabera, his colleague, also writes about dialectics, but is a libertarian and is decidedly not Marxist. So while we might be talking about dialectics as Marx's method, the method itself does not require one to be a Marxist. But that's a good thing in my estimation. But getting back to Scabera, he says, dialectics counsels us to study the object of our inquiry from a variety of perspectives and levels of generality, so as to gain a more comprehensive picture of it. That study often requires that we grasp the object in terms of the larger system in which it's situated, as well as its development across time. Because humans are not omniscient. Because none of us can see we can't see the whole in a godlike perspective. It's only through selective abstraction that we're able to piece together a more integrated understanding of the phenomenon before us, an understanding of its antecedent conditions, its interrelationships, and its tendencies. And I'll point to the dance of the dialectic to demonstrate this. I'm not going to make you get up and do the dance, but if you look at the first step is to analyze what's going on in the present moment. So we look for connections that exist in our present. As Ullman says, he calls it the capitalist present. We can think about what are the perspectives on the issue from whatever the issue is from different social actors. What are the things that are going on? The next step is to historicize the present by looking for the historical antecedents of what we found in our analysis of the present. And the third step is to move from the past through the present into the future, or at least to envision the future and to envision what it may be like if we were to resolve the social contradictions that we've identified in our analysis and in our historical studies. The fourth step brings us back to the present. We're where we started, but we're not on the same plane. So in the dance, you have to jump. And I forgot, we didn't jump the other day, but you have to jump. You're in the present, but you're on a higher plane, you know? It's like I'm sitting here now, but if I was to engage in dialectics, I would be sitting here now. Not literally, but. Another way to think about this, and if you're, well, everybody uses a camera now, but it's not really a camera. And if you think about your old style single reflex lens cameras, you know, you have the big telephoto lens and you have the really small wide angle lenses. That's another way to think about this idea, because abstraction is like using camera lenses at different focal lengths. So we zoom in on an object. When we do that, we can think about asking the question, what is the history of this thing? Whatever the thing is a concept, a narrative, whatever it is. What is the history of it? Because every narrative, every story, every concept has a history. That's like using a telephoto lens. Or we could use a wide angle lens to capture more of a scene. That's like asking the question, what is the social context of this issue now? What is the social context of this issue now? This raises important questions then in our investigations. Where do we start? What does one look for? Traditionally, in teaching social studies, the inquiry starts with small parts and attempts to establish connections with other parts, leading to an understanding of a larger whole. What dialectics ask us to do is to begin with the whole, the system, or as much of it as we can understand, and then inquiring into the part or parts of it to see how it fits and functions and leads to a fuller understanding of the whole. For example, many people of various political persuasions have pointed out the paradox of the growing wealth of the few and the increasing poverty of the many, as well as connections between the interests of corporations, the actions of governments, and of being powerless and poor. For example, this week we had a crisis in the stock markets all over the world, and it was front page news everywhere. But the stock market is not the economy. That's one thing that the newspapers don't talk about. As far as the newspapers are concerned, the stock market is the economy. As Ullman points out, despite the awareness of these relations, most people do not take these observations seriously. They lack a theory that makes sense for what they're seeing. People don't know what importance to give it. They forget about what they've just seen. They exercise the contradictions by labeling them a paradox. So they don't fit, the small pieces don't seem to fit together, so I'm not going to think about it. The problem is that the socialization that we undergo, both in schools and society, encourages us to focus on the particulars of our circumstances and to ignore the interconnections. Thus, we miss the patterns that emerge from relations. Social studies plays an important role in reinforcing this tendency. The social sciences break up human knowledge into various disciplines: history, geography, anthropology, sociology, each with its own distinctive language and ways of knowing, which encourages concentrating on the bits and pieces of the human experience. What existed before is usually taken as given and is unchanging. As a result, political and economic upheavals, such as the revolutions of 1789, 1848, 1917, and 1989, are treated as anomalous events with discrete explanations. Another example of that would be, especially in North America, teaching the history of wars in the 20th century. Fascism is embodied in individuals, in Hitler, in Franco, and now perhaps in neo-fascists like Trump. Is he neo-fascist? He's close enough for me to say he's neo-fascist. Or other leaders in the rightward swing in Europe. And in the United States and Canada, Trump is presented as an individual phenomenon. The critiques are of his personal points of view, without taking a long-range view, yet the history of fascism and authoritarianism. That's the point I'm trying to make. There are connections. Dialectical thinking, on the other hand, is an effort to understand the world in terms of interconnections, the ties among things as they are right now, their own preconditions, and their future possibilities. The dialectical method takes change as a given and treats apparent stability as what needs to be explained. Most of the time, we think about revolutions as points of change, and that's why we would teach about them in school. We don't connect the dots on the revolutions that illustrates that history is a history of continual revolution and transformation. It's the changing of the human experience. What needs to be explained, what is the anomaly, is when things are stable, not when things are changing. Dialectical thinking is an approach to understanding the world that requires not only a lot of facts that are usually hidden from view, but a more interconnected grasp of the facts that we already know. Dialectics. Okay, that's the end of that. That's where I was confused on my brain. That wasn't a great ending. No, that wasn't a great ending to that section. I knew that was going to mess me up. Okay, the third question. What citizenship? Or what kind of citizenship? The notion of dangerous citizenship is something I developed with Kevin D. Vinson, who's been a professor in the United States and in the Caribbean for a number of years, and is now out of academia. Early on, we were inspired by the work of the French Situationists and the events of May 1968 in Paris. We asked ourselves, how could we use the work of Guy Debord and Raoul Vaneam in particular to understand and respond to contemporary educational context? May 1968 in France was a revolutionary moment aimed at transforming the social and moral aspects of the old society, and was focused in particular on educational institutions. Hundreds of thousands of university students and their allies, including high school students, but not trade unionists and not the established left, took over universities and battled the police and the military while invoking situationist-inspired slogans such as "Be realistic, demand the impossible." 1968 saw student rebellions around the world, in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Japan, across Europe and the United States. In many cases, the state responded violently. In Mexico, police and the military occupied the campus of UNAM, the largest university in Latin America, and massacred hundreds, perhaps thousands of students at Tlatelolco. It's quite clear that exercising popular democratic rights with the aim of transforming the old society is a dangerous undertaking. Schools have always been about some form of citizenship education, framed primarily from the essentialist view of the good citizen as the knower of traditional facts, but there have been attempts to develop social reconstructionist views of the good citizen as an agent of progressive or even radical social change. Given its fundamental concern with the nature of society, the meanings of democracy, etc., social studies education has always been in this contested territory. Dangerous citizenship is about crafting an agenda dedicated to the creation of education that struggles against and disrupts inequalities and oppressions. Classroom practice that is committed to exploring and affecting the contingencies of understanding and action and the possibilities of eradicating exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence in both schools and society. In essence, dangerous citizenship requires people individually and collectively to take actions and behaviors that bring with them certain dangers, like those faced by the students in 1968. It transcends traditional maneuvers such as voting or signing petitions, and instead strives for a praxis-inspired mindset of opposition and resistance, and acceptance of a certain tactical stance. Of course, the implication is that dangerous citizenship is dangerous to an oppressive and socially unjust status quo, to existing hierarchical structures of power. Dangerous citizenship embodies three fundamental generalities: political participation or non-participation, at least non-participation in the traditional sense. That would be embodied in the phrase, don't vote, engage in politics. Don't vote, engage in politics. The second generality would be a critical awareness, in particular in the sense of Paulo Freire's notion of critical awareness, and then intentional action. Its underlying aim rests upon the imperatives of resistance, meaning, disruption, and disorder. In essence, dangerous citizenship is a conceptual container for developing a radical critique of education as social control and a collection of strategies that can be used to disrupt and resist the conforming, anti-democratic, anti-collective, and oppressive potentialities of neoliberal education and society. I'm just going to briefly describe four of the premises upon which dangerous citizenship is based. I'm not going to take time to go through any examples here today, although I did focus on some of those when I spoke here a few years ago, but I would be happy to share those examples with you later. The premises of dangerous citizenship include firstly, democracy and capitalism are incompatible. Democracy and capitalism are incompatible. In other words, and I'm not going to take time to elaborate on this here, but my argument is that capital always dominates democracy. Capital, or capitalism, always dominates democracy. That gives us the really existing democracy that we have, which falls short of the ideals that we hold for democracy. Secondly, teachers and curriculum have been subjected to intensifying policy regimes that attack academic freedom and discourage critical social analysis. Thirdly, capitalist schools are aimed at social control and winning over children to be loyal, obedient, dutiful, and useful to the ruling classes. Not only children, but teachers. All of us are part of that, what Noam Chomsky talks about as the 20%, the political class. We're not 1%ers. I don't know, unless you guys get paid a lot more than me. We're not 1%ers, but we're in the 20% in the sense that we are the targets of mass media. You know, I am the target of the New York Times and the Washington Post. I gladly subscribe to the New York Times. As Noam Chomsky, when someone asked him what newspapers he read, he said he read the New York Times and the Financial Post because he wanted to know what they thought, that that's the way you position yourself. But teachers are targets of, just like children are targets, to be loyal, obedient, dutiful, and useful. It's one of the, and we could elaborate, well, I could, but I'm not. I'm just going to say that's why teachers are subjected to human capital policies, because teachers are dangerous. Teachers are dangerous. Not all teachers understand that, but the ruling classes understand that. Fourth premise, civil obedience, not civil disobedience, is the problem we must overcome to transform education and society. So our problem is, this is Howard Zinn, the American historian, made this comment many years ago, that civil obedience is the problem, not civil disobedience. So dangerous citizenship challenges assumptions about the state of the world and requires exploration of questions that make some uncomfortable. Given what we know about the lack of democracy in the world today, is it even possible to teach for democracy that is not dominated by capital? Is it possible to teach for a democracy that is not the capitalist version of democracy? Do we want to teach for capitalist democracy? Is there an alternative to capitalist democracy? Is the concept of democracy bankrupt? Is democracy as a concept in practice even salvageable? If democracy is salvageable, then it seems to me that teaching about and for democracy in contemporary times cannot be done without engaging the complexities and the contradictions that have come to define what really existing or non-existing democracy is. It is a practice that must be understood as difficult, risky, and even dangerous. So this goes back to my question of the graffiti on the sidewalk. What kind of democracy? Because in my mind, authoritarianism, which the graffiti posed, dictatorship or democracy, I think we can look at points now where we have democracy is authoritarianism. So this is a problem for social studies educators. Okay. What future? I want to talk a little bit about individuals, institutions, and social change. I'm going to use the term critical pedagogy. And if you're familiar with the critical pedagogy literature, you know what I mean. I'm talking about the work of people like Paulo Freire, Peter McLaren, Henry Giroux, Joe Kinchlow. Those are probably the most popular writers, but there are many others. And there is actually a range of views that exists within critical pedagogy, although many people think they're embodied just in those folks I just mentioned. The core idea of critical pedagogy is to submit received understandings to critical analysis with the aim of increasing human knowledge and freedom. Now, Ira Shore offers a very straightforward description of what critical pedagogy is. Habits of thought, reading, writing, speaking, which go beneath the surface of meaning. It goes beneath first impressions, dominant myths, official pronouncements, traditional cliches, received wisdom, mere opinions, to understand the deep meaning, the root causes, the social context, the ideology, the personal consequences of any action, any event, object, process, organization, experience, text, subject matter, policy, mass media, or discourse. It's as simple as that. On that count, I think there are a lot of people who are critical pedagogues that we don't think of as critical pedagogues. Certainly, John Dewey didn't share the same ideology, doesn't share the same ideology as our Shore does, or Henry Giroux, or Peter McLaren. But they would be certainly in agreement on that definition of critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy as a practice has been critiqued both internally and externally. For example, Peter McLaren has lamented what he calls the domestication of critical pedagogy. That is, critical pedagogy efforts that have been accommodated into the mainstream liberal humanism and progressivism. And he calls them a marked flirtation with, but never a full commitment to, revolutionary praxis. On the other hand, postmodernist education researcher Elizabeth Ellsworth maintains that the discourse of critical pedagogy gives rise to repressive myths that perpetuate relations of domination, where objects, nature, and others are seen to be unknown or ultimately unknowable in the sense of being defined, delineated, captured, understood, explained, and diagnosed at the level of a determination never accorded to the knower herself or himself. In some ways, this difference, what the external critique that Ellsworth is using is an embodiment of the critique of Marxist theorizing in education and what's easily labeled as postmodernist approaches. Ellsworth says, if you can talk to me in ways that show you understand that your knowledge of me and the world and the right thing to do will also always be partial, interested, and potentially oppressive to others, and if I can do the same, then we can work together on shaping and reshaping alliances for constructing circumstances in which students of difference can thrive. This is an argument that's gone on for a long time. Most of the time I tend to side on the Marxist critical pedagogy side and not the postmodernist side. But I think critical pedagogues who have made many important contributions, but there is, in Ellsworth's critique, the identification of a blind spot within critical pedagogy regarding the individual, the personal, and identity. And I want to talk about that just for a moment. In his excellent history of the democratic free school movement in the United States in the 1960s, Ron Miller revives the legacy of John Holt. Holt was a moralist and a reformer, a thinker described as a social ecologist and a constructive postmodernist. He became closely associated with the deschooling and homeschooling movements in North America. Holt's emphasis on the personal dimension of social reality addresses the blind spot within critical pedagogy, which too often privileges institutional analysis at the expense of existential authenticity. That is, the individual person's concern that his or her life is meaningful and fulfilling. I rediscovered Holt when I offered 3 years ago a seminar on alternative education. And I was interested in particular in the free school movement, in the modern school, the anarchist modern school movement of Francisco Ferrer and others. And through reading that literature, kind of moved me in this argument between critical pedagogy literature and Ellsworth's critique and other postmodernist critique of critical pedagogy to this focus on Holt's work. Holt described his deepest interest as how can we adults work to create a more decent, humane, conserving, peaceful, just community, nation, and world? How can we make it possible for children to join us in that work? Holt emphasized the connection between the social and the individual, between the political and the existential. Human beings could not grow in a fragmented and violent culture. But at the same time, a decent culture would only emerge when people personally experienced meaning and fulfillment. And Holt held several fundamental principles that I think we should take seriously as critical educators. The dignity and value of human existence, and the faith in the human capacity to learn. A concern for freedom and belief that it is being seriously eroded by the impersonality of large organizations and the forms of surveillance and control practiced in social institutions, particularly schools. Thirdly, opposition to centralized political and economic power that rests on scientific, technological management of natural and human resources. And lastly, the driving concern for the need of each person to find meaningful, fulfilling sense of identity in a mass society. Holt sought through a renewal of culture, sought a thorough renewal of culture that would be as concerned with personal wholeness and authenticity as with social justice. He worked in the tradition of Thoreau. He saw himself as a decentralist who leaned in the direction of anarchism. He did not so much seek to reform social institutions as to circumvent and thus deflate them. Holt was primarily concerned about human growth and learning, but he focused on the relationship between social institutions and human development. In Miller's reassessment of Holt, he argues that what distinguishes Holt's position from progressive critiques was his insistence that the reform of social institutions alone was not sufficient for cultural renewal. For Holt, the source of violence, racism, and exploitation was not in the institutions as such, but in the psychological reality people experienced as they lived in society. This is really an important implication for critical pedagogy. It is that which focuses on institutional transformation and has neglected the existential dimension of meaning to often ignoring personal desire for belonging, community, and moral commitment. To be clear, neither Holt nor I am advocating a perspective that is merely personal or individualistic. Holt was very aware of political forces and expressed his concern that the worship of progress and growth was inevitably leading to fascism. In his 1970 book, titled "What Do I Do on Monday?", Holt suggests that alienation bred by authoritarian education could prepare the ground for some naive American brand of fascism, which now seems uncomfortably close. Miller quotes a letter Holt wrote to Paul Goodman. Goodman was the author of Growing Up Absurd. And Holt wrote, "I keep looking for and hoping to find evidence that Americans are not as callous and greedy and cruel and envious as I fear they are, and I keep getting disappointed. What scares me is the amount of fascism in people's spirits, in the government, that so many of our fellow citizens would get if they could scares me. It is the government that so many of our fellow citizens would get if they could that scares me, and I fear we're moving in that direction. Unfortunately, Holt was prescient about politics in the United States, as well as about institutional, particularly school reform, and an effective path for social change. In 1971, Holt wrote, and I quote here, "I do not believe that any movement for educational reform that addresses itself exclusively or even primarily to the problems or needs of children can progress very far. In short, in a society that is absurd, unworkable, wasteful, destructive, coercive, monopolistic, and generally anti-human, we could never have good education, no matter what kind of schools the powers that be permit, because it is not the educators or the schools, but the whole society and the quality of life in it that really educate." He continues, "More and more it seems to me, and this is a reversal of what I felt not long ago, that it makes very little sense to talk about education for social change, as if education was or could be a kind of getting ready. The best and perhaps only education for social change is action to bring about that change. There cannot be little worlds fit for children in a world not fit for anyone else." In his 1972 book, Freedom and Beyond, Holt grappled with the key concepts of critical pedagogy: social justice, racism, poverty, class conflict, and he argued that schools were contributing to these problems rather than helping to solve them. He wondered whether we're trying to salve our consciences by asking our children to do what we can't and don't want to do. Holt concluded that schools tend to take learning out of its context and turn it into an abstraction, a commodity. Whereas he once said, I'm enough of an anarchist to feel that things are improved in general when they are improved in their particulars. And this is a principle that addresses, at least in part, the concerns that Ellsworth famously raised in her critique of critical pedagogy. Holt argued that attempting to change society through schools was an evasion of personal responsibility, because authentic meaning can never be cultivated en masse. People don't change their ideas, much less their lives, because someone else comes along with a clever argument to show how they're wrong. So critical educators are left with a conundrum. The question becomes, how can we create a better balance between the abstraction, a focus on the general nature of things, and authenticity, a focus on the particulars, within critical approaches to teaching and learning? And this is my conclusion. Social studies is the most dangerous of all school subjects. The danger, however, is a matter of perspective. Like the schools in which it is taught, social studies is full of alluring contradictions. It harbors possibilities for inquiry and social criticism, liberation and emancipation. Social studies could be a site that enables young people to analyze and understand social issues in a holistic way, finding and tracing relations and interconnections, both present and past, in an effort to build meaningful understandings of a problem, its context, and history, to envision a future where specific social problems are resolved, and to take action to bring that vision into existence. Social studies could be a place where students learn to speak for themselves in order to achieve, or at least strive towards, an equal degree of participation in a better future. Social studies could be this place, but for the most part, it is not. In practice, social studies has been and continues to be profoundly conserving in nature. Social studies is the engine room of illusion factories whose primary aim is reproduction of the existing social order, where the ruling ideas exist to be memorized, regurgitated, internalized, and lived by. Social studies too often teaches myths instead of encouraging critical explorations of human existence. Schools are fundamentally authoritarian, hierarchical institutions. They produce myriad oppressive and inequitable byproducts, and social studies is an integral component in this process. The challenge, perhaps impossibility, is discovering ways in which schools in general, and social studies in particular, can contribute to positive liberty. That is, a society where individuals have the power and the resources to realize and fulfill their own potential, free of the obstacles of classism and racism, sexism, and other inequalities encouraged by educational systems and the influence of the state and religious ideologies. A society where people have the agency and capacity to make their own free choices and act independently based on reason, not authority, not tradition, and not dogma. In 1843, Arnold Rouge, overcome by revolutionary despair, wrote a letter to Karl Marx. And he lamented the impossibility of revolution because the German people were too docile. Our nation has no future. So what's the point of appealing to it? To which Marx replied, "You will hardly suggest that my opinion of the present is too exalted. And if I do not despair about it, this is only because its desperation fills me with hope." This is an example of what philosopher Giorgio Agamben has called the courage of hopelessness. The courage of hopelessness is an optimistic response to pessimistic circumstances. It's the equivalent of responding to the criticism that you're being too idealistic with "be realistic, demand the impossible." The hegemonic system of global capitalism dominates not because people agree with it, it rules because people are convinced there's no alternative. Indeed, the dominant approach to schooling and curriculum, particularly in social studies education, is aimed at indoctrinating students into this belief. Utopian thinking allows us to consider alternatives and pedagogical imaginaries in an attempt to open up spaces for rethinking our approaches to learning, teaching, and experiencing the world. These imaginaries are necessary because traditional tropes of social studies curriculum, that is, teaching democracy, voting, democratic citizenship in the traditional senses, are essentially lies we tell ourselves and our students because democracy is incompatible with capitalism. Capitalist democracy creates a shallow version, a spectator version of democracy at best, and democracy as it operates now is inseparable from empire and perpetual war and vast social inequalities. So we certainly have plenty of fuel for our hopes. The challenge we face as social studies educators is not to warm our students' hearts with empty hopes, but rather to confront what are seemingly hopeless times for freedom and equality with a pedagogy and a curriculum that come from a courage of hopelessness. Our aim should be to rethink social studies so it becomes a site where students can develop personally meaningful understandings of the world, recognize that they have agency to act on the world, and to make change. Social studies should not be about showing life to people, but bringing them to life. The aim is not getting students to listen to an entertaining lecture, but getting them to speak for themselves, to understand people make their own history, even if they make it in already existing circumstances. These principles are the foundation for a new social studies, one that is not driven by standardized curriculum or examinations, but by the perceived needs, interests, and desires of our students, our communities of shared interest, and ourselves as educators. Thank you very much.